In the rolling Yorkshire countryside, where green hills roll toward the North Sea and ancient stone walls mark boundaries unchanged for centuries, there stands a manor house that has witnessed nearly 500 years of English history. But within its timber-framed halls and stone corridors dwells something that defies explanation. A presence so persistent, so documented, so undeniably real to hundreds of witnesses that it forced Victorian society to confront a question they had been desperately trying to avoid. What happens to us after death? The story of Burton Agnes Hall is not like other ghost stories. This is not a tale of shadowy apparitions glimpsed in fog, nor the product of folklore distorted across generations, nor the imaginative creation of Gothic novelists seeking to thrill their audiences. This is a haunting so thoroughly documented, so extensively witnessed by credible observers, so consistent across centuries that it stands as perhaps the most compelling evidence in the history of psychical research that consciousness survives bodily death. And it all began on a terrible autumn evening in 1605, when a young woman's final wish was brutally ignored, a denial that would echo through the centuries to come. Welcome back to History Unleashed, where we investigate the mysteries that challenge our fundamental understanding of reality and the boundaries between life and death. I'm your host, and today we're venturing into one of England's most famous and well-documented hauntings, the extraordinary story of Abbess Agnes and the ghost that has refused to be forgotten for over 400 years. From the desperate final words of a dying woman to the systematic investigations of Victorian spiritualists, from the psychological torment of residents to the undeniable physical evidence that persists to this day, we'll explore every layer of this haunting that changed how an entire culture understood death and the supernatural. If you're ready to discover a ghost story grounded in historical fact, witnessed by hundreds of credible observers, and documented through centuries with remarkable consistency, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because what we're about to uncover challenges the materialist assumptions that have dominated Western civilization and suggests that death may not be the ending we've been taught to believe it is. So settle in, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a journey into one of England's most authentic hauntings, where the veil between worlds grows thin, where the past refuses to stay past, and where a woman's love transcends the boundary between life and death itself. The story of Burton Agnes Hall begins not with haunting, but with creation, with the construction of a manor house that would become one of the architectural jewels of Renaissance England and the setting for a tragedy that would reshape the house's entire destiny. To understand the haunting, we must first understand the house itself, and the family that built it with aspirations of permanence and glory that death itself would not diminish. Burton Agnes was established as a significant landholding in Yorkshire during the Anglo-Saxon period, but the magnificent manor house we know today was conceived in the imagination of Sir Henry Griffith, a wealthy English gentleman whose ambitions extended far beyond the ordinary aspirations of country landowners. In 1598, as Queen Elizabeth I was in the final years of her reign and England stood at a threshold between medieval and early modern worlds, Griffith began construction on a house that would demonstrate his wealth, his taste, and his connection to the transforming power of Renaissance culture reaching northward from London. The house Griffith built was extraordinary for its time, a masterpiece of late Elizabethan and early Jacobean architecture that combined traditional English manor house elements with sophisticated Renaissance influences. The structure featured the distinctive red brick and limestone construction that had become fashionable among the English gentry, decorative chimneys that reached toward the sky like the aspirations of their owner, and interior spaces designed to display wealth and refinement through carved wooden panels, elaborate plasterwork, and furnishings imported from across Europe. The construction of such a house was not merely an architectural achievement, but a statement about permanence and legacy. Griffith was declaring through stone and brick that his family would endure, that his wealth and status would persist, that Burton Agnes would stand as a monument to the Griffith name for generations to come. The house was built not just for living but for lasting, designed to transcend the mortality of individual inhabitants through the permanence of its physical structure. Sir Henry Griffith had 3 daughters, Anne, Catherine, and Margaret, each of whom represented his aspirations for family continuity and social advancement through advantageous marriages. The daughters were educated, accomplished, and prepared for the roles that their father had envisioned for them within the networks of English gentry society. Anne, the eldest daughter, was particularly noted for her intelligence, her artistic accomplishments, and her strong-willed personality characteristics that would prove significant in ways Griffith could never have anticipated. Anne Griffith's life at Burton Agnes in the early years of the 17th century was that of a young noblewoman of considerable privilege and limited autonomy. She lived within the carefully prescribed sphere that English society had designated for unmarried daughters of the gentry. Accomplishments in music, painting, needlework, and dancing were cultivated to make her an attractive marriage prospect. Yet her actual control over her destiny was minimal. Her life would be determined by her father's decisions about whom she would marry, an arrangement typical for women of her social position in that era. The arrangements for Anne's marriage had been carefully negotiated, as such things were among the gentry. A suitable match had been identified, a marriage that would benefit the Griffith family through connections and social advancement. Anne appears to have accepted her fate with the resignation that women of her time were expected to maintain regarding such matters. She had been prepared her entire life for this transition from her father's household to that of her husband, understanding it as the inevitable course of a woman's life. But fate, in the form of a violent encounter on a Yorkshire road, would intervene in ways that no one could have predicted. On an autumn day in 1605, as Anne traveled between estates, bandits attacked her carriage. The violence of the assault, the brutality of the robbery combined with the trauma of violation, left Anne seriously injured. The physical wounds would heal, but the psychological and spiritual trauma of the assault would mark her profoundly and appear to have altered her understanding of her place in the world and her relationship to the house that had been her sanctuary. The attack on Anne Griffith stands at the threshold of this story, the moment where the orderly progression of a gentry family's life was disrupted by violence and chaos. The incident would have ramifications far beyond the immediate trauma. It appears to have crystallized something in Anne's consciousness, some recognition of her own vulnerability and mortality, some questioning of the purposes for which she lived and the values that her society had instilled in her. The years following the attack appear to have been difficult ones for Anne. She survived her injuries, but something in her had changed. The cheerful accomplishments and social graces that had been cultivated in her were replaced by a more serious, contemplative demeanor. She became deeply religious in ways that suggest spiritual searching, rather than mere conventional piety. She devoted herself to artistic and creative pursuits with an intensity that suggests she was processing trauma and seeking meaning through creative expression. Here's something that reveals how trauma and near-death experiences can transform people's understanding of themselves and their purpose. From which country are you watching this? Because every culture has stories about people whose brushes with death altered their life trajectories and spiritual understanding. What examples can you think of from your tradition of people who transformed after traumatic experiences? How did their encounters with mortality change what they valued and what they devoted themselves to? Share your thoughts in the comments. Anne never married. Whether this was by choice or circumstance is unclear from the historical record, but the decision, or situation, appears to have suited her. She remained at Burton Agnes, gradually becoming the heart and creative center of the household, the person who gave the house its personality and meaning. She pursued artistic endeavors, engaged in charitable work, participated in the spiritual life of the community, and developed what appears to have been a profound identification with Burton Agnes itself, not as a possession, but as an extension of herself, as a living thing that embodied her hopes and values. Her father, Sir Henry Griffith, died in 1619, leaving the estate to his son Richard. Richard apparently recognized his sister Anne's profound connection to Burton Agnes and allowed her to remain in the house, an arrangement that was not unusual for unmarried daughters of means in this period. But that speaks to Richard's respect for Anne and his recognition of her deep bond with the place. The 1620s and 1630s appear to have been a period of relative peace and contentment for Anne at Burton Agnes. She was in her 30s and 40s, an age when women's social authority increased as their reproductive years declined, and she appears to have achieved a kind of freedom within her family that she might not have experienced as a younger woman. She had authority over the household, influence over the estate's operations, and the time and resources to pursue her interests in art, spirituality, and the beautification and improvement of Burton Agnes. During these years, Anne appears to have made the house itself a kind of canvas for her values and aesthetic vision. She commissioned artwork, oversaw renovations and decorations, and generally invested the house with her own personality. Most significantly, she appears to have developed a profound spiritual connection to the place, not merely as a building but as a living entity that reflected her own soul and held her legacy. The spiritual understanding that animated Anne's relationship to Burton Agnes was likely influenced by the religious ferment of 17th century England. This was an era of intense religious questioning, of Protestant reforms creating new ways of thinking about faith and spirituality, of people seeking direct experience of the divine rather than relying solely on institutional religious structures. Anne's documented piety suggests she was engaged with these spiritual currents, seeking meaning and connection through devotion and contemplation. It was within this context of deep spiritual seeking, of profound identification with a place, of a life devoted to creating beauty and meaning, that Anne Griffith arrived at her final illness. The historical record is sparse regarding the details of her final sickness, but by all accounts her health began to decline in the early 1640s. The exact nature of her illness is unknown, but it appears to have been serious enough that those around her understood she was dying. As Anne Griffith lay dying in Burton Agnes Hall, watching the Yorkshire landscape she loved from her window, her consciousness appears to have been intensely focused on a single concern: what would happen to her beloved house after her death? The question was not merely practical. Anne's identification with Burton Agnes had become so profound that the question of the house's future and the preservation of her values and legacy within it had become the central preoccupation of her final days. The exact circumstances of Anne's final moments vary slightly depending on the historical source. Accounts from different periods emphasize different details and contain contradictions that are inevitable when stories are transmitted across centuries. However, the fundamental narrative remains consistent across all sources. As Anne approached death, she made a final request of her family that reflected her understanding of what mattered most in her life. Anne's dying wish was that her skull be preserved and kept within the walls of Burton Agnes Hall. The request seems shocking to modern sensibilities, yet it makes profound sense when understood within the context of Anne's spiritual understanding and her identification with the house. The skull, the bone that houses consciousness, that persists after death when the flesh has returned to dust, was understood in Anne's era and in many spiritual traditions as the seat of the person's essence. By requesting that her skull remain in the house, Anne was asking that her essential self, her consciousness and identity, remain connected to the place she loved and the values she had invested in it. The request also reflects an understanding that the boundary between life and death was not absolute, that consciousness might persist, that meaningful connection with the living world could continue after bodily death. Anne's dying wish suggests that she was not attempting to escape death, but rather to transform her relationship to it, to transcend the limitation of bodily mortality through a form of continuation that would allow her to remain present to the house and to those who inhabited it. The historical record indicates that Anne's family, particularly her brother Richard, initially agreed to honor her dying wish. As Anne Griffith expired, the promise was made that her skull would be preserved and kept within Burton Agnes Hall, that this final request would be respected and honored by future generations of the family. Yet the promise was not kept. Whether through forgetfulness, through a change of heart, through the practical difficulties of preserving human remains, or through superstitious fear that began to emerge after Anne's death, the family chose to bury Anne's skull along with the rest of her remains in the churchyard at Burton Agnes, a burial that violated her explicit final wish and, according to all subsequent accounts, proved to be a catastrophic mistake. The consequences of this betrayal of Anne's dying wish began to manifest almost immediately. Family members reported experiencing strange phenomena within the house: mysterious sounds, apparitions, a presence that seemed to fill the rooms with an oppressive emotional atmosphere. At first, these experiences might have been dismissed as the ordinary creaks and moans of an old house settling, the natural sounds that all houses produce in their timbers and walls. But the experiences escalated in ways that could not be attributed to ordinary causes. The presence that manifested in Burton Agnes was described as deeply disturbing, not threatening or violent in any way, but rather sorrowful, anguished, insistent. Family members who encountered it reported feeling waves of overwhelming emotion, as though they were being confronted with profound grief and betrayal. Some described hearing voices, Anne's voice calling out in distress, expressing her anguish at her final wish being denied, demanding that her skull be brought back to the house. The manifestations escalated over months and years. What had begun as strange sounds and fleeting impressions developed into increasingly undeniable phenomena. The house became difficult to inhabit. Visitors and family members reported constant disturbances, a pervasive sense of unease, the unmistakable feeling of a presence demanding attention and acknowledgement. The peaceful sanctuary that Burton Agnes had been under Anne's living care seemed to transform into a place haunted by suffering. The accounts from this period suggest that the family was genuinely troubled by what was occurring, that they recognized something significant was happening that defied ordinary explanation, yet they appear to have been uncertain about how to respond. Bringing up Anne's burial and her dying wish opened questions about whether the family would have to exhume her remains, a disturbing prospect both psychologically and practically. The situation created a conflict between honoring the dead and the social awkwardness and scandal that would come from acknowledging that the family had failed to keep their promise to a dying woman for several years. The situation apparently persisted in this state of unresolved tension. The manifestations continued. The emotional and psychological toll on the household mounted, and the reputation of Burton Agnes began to change, from a respected family seat to a place whispered about as troubled and strange. The haunting became the subject of local gossip, of servants' tales, of the kind of folklore that develops around places where strange events are occurring. Eventually, the exact timeline is unclear from historical accounts, but it appears to have been several years after Anne's death. The family reached a decision. The disturbances were too persistent, too distressing, too undeniable to ignore. The recognition that they had violated their promise to Anne became overwhelming. Whether through guilt, through the mounting psychological pressure of living in a haunted house, or through genuine conviction that Anne's spirit required what had been promised, the family decided to rectify their betrayal. Anne's grave was opened. Her remains were exhumed from the churchyard. Her skull was carefully separated from the rest of her skeleton and brought back to Burton Agnes Hall. Brought back to the place she loved, to the place where she had devoted her life, to the place that had become inseparable from her identity and understanding of herself. The accounts from the moment the skull was returned to the house describe an immediate transformation. The disturbances ceased. The oppressive emotional atmosphere that had filled the rooms lifted. The grief-stricken presence that had been tormenting the household seemed to achieve peace, to find closure, to finally experience the resolution it had been demanding. The house, which had been unbearable to inhabit for years, became peaceful again. Here's something that reveals how across cultures and throughout history, people have understood that the dead require respect and that violating their wishes can have consequences. From which country are you watching this? Because your culture certainly has traditions and beliefs about honoring the dead and respecting final wishes. What examples can you think of from your region's history, where disrespect toward the dead resulted in understood consequences? How does your culture understand the relationship between the living and the dead? Share your thoughts in the comments. The skull was placed in a small chamber within the house. Accounts vary regarding the exact location, but it appears to have been kept in a secure place where it was preserved and recognized as a significant object deserving respect. The family made the decision that the skull would remain in Burton Agnes Hall, that it would be protected and honored, and that future generations would understand its significance and maintain the respect that Anne had required. The cessation of the disturbances once the skull was returned to the house struck the household as nothing short of miraculous. The transformation was so complete, so immediate, and so dramatic that it appeared to provide empirical confirmation of what had been occurring, that Anne's spirit had indeed been calling out, demanding what had been promised and that her presence had achieved peace only when her final wish was honored. The experience created a profound conviction within the family that something authentic and significant had occurred, that the boundary between life and death was more permeable than the materialist assumptions of the emerging modern worldview were willing to acknowledge. The decades following the return of Anne's skull to Burton Agnes Hall witnessed a transformation of the haunting from something disturbing and tormenting into something entirely different, a presence that became integrated into the life of the house, accepted and even welcomed by those who inhabited it, understood as a manifestation of Anne's continuing connection to the place she had loved and the family she had devoted herself to protecting. The accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries describe the haunting in terms that suggest an ongoing awareness and presence, rather than random ghostly disturbances. Anne appeared to remain conscious and engaged with the life of the house, sensitive to what was happening within its walls, responsive to the well-being of those who lived there, protective of the property and the value she had invested in it. Family members and servants reported consistent patterns of phenomena that suggested Anne's presence monitoring and responding to events within the house. When individuals were in genuine need, the reports suggest Anne's presence would make itself known in ways that appeared comforting and supportive. When problems arose threatening the house or its inhabitants, her presence appeared to activate in ways that seemed protective and interventional. The haunting evolved from something that seemed to express anger and demand justice into something that felt more like ongoing presence and care. One category of manifestation that became particularly consistent involved Anne's apparent awareness and disapproval of theft or misconduct within the household. Servants who attempted to steal from the house reported being confronted by Anne's presence in ways that were absolutely unmistakable. Apparitions, voices, or simply an overwhelming awareness that they were being observed and judged. Multiple accounts describe servants who had begun to pilfer items from the house, or who were engaged in misconduct being confronted by Anne's manifestations, which appear to have functioned as a form of moral enforcement and correction. The most famous account of this involved a kitchen maid who had been stealing items from the household. According to the historical record, the maid woke one night to find Anne's apparition standing at the foot of her bed, her presence radiating disapproval and judgment. The encounter was so profoundly disturbing that the maid immediately confessed to her thefts, returned what she had taken, and reformed her behavior. The account suggests that Anne's presence functioned not through violence or threat, but through the sheer force of moral judgment, the overwhelming awareness of being seen and evaluated by a consciousness that recognized wrongdoing and would not permit it to continue unchallenged. Other manifestations suggest that Anne's presence extended to concern for the physical safety and welfare of those living in the house. Family members and servants reported instances where they were prevented from entering dangerous situations through Anne's interventions, an inner voice warning them away from a room where the ceiling was about to collapse, a sense of presence preventing them from walking into a hazard they couldn't see, or protective phenomena that seemed to keep inhabitants safe from harm. The relationship that developed between the household and Anne's presence over the decades appears to have evolved into something approaching domesticity. Rather than experiencing the haunting as a constant torment or source of fear, family members learned to recognize Anne's manifestations as a form of presence they could anticipate and understand. The house, instead of being experienced as an oppressive and disturbing place, became understood as inhabited by a protective consciousness that had the family's best interests at heart. The treatment of Anne's skull became increasingly ritualized and respectful. The family understood that the skull was not merely a preserved human bone, but a connection to Anne's consciousness and presence, the physical anchor through which her spiritual engagement with the house was maintained. The skull was handled with reverence, kept in a place of honor, and treated as an object of significance. Family members and servants understood that the skull must be maintained and protected, that its preservation was essential to the continuation of Anne's presence and protection. This understanding raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness, physicality, and the relationship between material objects and immaterial awareness. The family's belief and behavior suggests that they understood the skull not as a mere artifact, but as a genuine connection to Anne's consciousness, that through the physical continuity of her remains, Anne's awareness could manifest and remain engaged with the physical world she had inhabited during her lifetime. The 18th and 19th centuries brought changes to English culture and worldview that complicated the relationship between reason and belief, between scientific materialism and spiritual understanding. The emerging scientific worldview of the Enlightenment brought skepticism towards supernatural claims and a tendency to dismiss phenomena that couldn't be explained through mechanistic principles. Yet Burton Agnes Hall and its haunting persisted, immune to the intellectual fashions of the era, continuing to manifest in ways that defied the materialist assumptions that were increasingly dominating educated discourse. It was during this period that formal investigations of the Burton Agnes haunting began, investigations that applied systematic observation and documentation to phenomena that the emerging scientific community was generally disposed to dismiss as superstition or delusion. These investigations would prove remarkably significant in the development of what became known as spiritualism and psychical research disciplines that attempted to apply scientific methodology to phenomena that seemed to suggest survival of consciousness after death. Here's something that reveals how the confrontation between scientific worldviews and spiritual experience has played out differently across cultures. From which country are you watching this? Because every tradition has had to grapple with how to honor and understand experiences that don't fit into prevailing rational frameworks. What examples can you think of from your culture's history where phenomena that seem to contradict dominant worldviews were eventually recognized as significant? How does your tradition navigate the tension between rational skepticism and openness to mysteries? Share your thoughts in the comments. The documentation of the Burton Agnes haunting began to take on increased significance during the Victorian era, when spiritualism emerged as a significant cultural movement in England and America. The mid-19th century saw the rise of seances, spirit photography, table rapping, and other forms of spiritual practice that attempted to bridge the gap between the material and spiritual worlds. The Burton Agnes case, with its centuries-long history of consistent manifestations and its respectable family witnesses, became important evidence in the spiritualist argument that consciousness survived bodily death. Spiritualist investigators and researchers began collecting accounts from the Burton Agnes family and household staff. They documented the history of the haunting, interviewed people who had experienced manifestations, and examined the skull that had remained the focal point of Anne's presence. The investigations were conducted with considerable rigor for the time, attempting to establish whether the phenomena could be explained through fraud, hallucination, or other conventional causes. The most significant finding from these investigations was the remarkable consistency and coherence of the haunting across centuries. The manifestations, while varying in their specific details, maintained consistent characteristics. Anne's presence was described consistently as protective, concerned with morality and justice, responsive to specific situations and needs within the household. The phenomena were witnessed by multiple individuals across generations, servants, family members, and visiting investigators, all of whom reported remarkably similar experiences. This consistency across time and across different observers was significant. It suggested that the haunting was not the product of suggestion or delusion, but rather something more objectively real. If the phenomena had been based in the psychology of individual witnesses, if they had been hallucinations or imagined experiences, we would expect significant variation across different observers and different time periods. Yet the remarkable consistency of the reports suggested something more like genuine encounters with an actual presence that was manifesting consistently regardless of the observer's expectations or psychological state. The Victorian investigations also raised an important methodological question. What standards of evidence would be appropriate for evaluating spiritual phenomena? The spiritualist investigators argued that eyewitness testimony, consistency across multiple observers, and the absence of obvious explanations through fraud or hallucination should be considered sufficient evidence for accepting the reality of the haunting. The skeptics responded that the absence of a conventional explanation wasn't the same as evidence for a supernatural one, that simply because something seemed inexplicable didn't mean it required a spiritual interpretation. The debate about Burton Agnes became emblematic of broader tensions in Victorian culture about how to evaluate and understand phenomena that seemed to contradict the materialist worldview that science had established. Here was a haunting with centuries of documentation, witnessed by hundreds of credible observers across generation. The most remarkable dimension of the Burton Agnes haunting involves a phenomenon that makes it unique among documented cases: the sustained, continuous interaction between the ghost of Anne Griffiths and the living inhabitants of the house across more than 4 centuries. This is not a ghost that manifests occasionally under particular circumstances. This is an ongoing presence that has become integrated into the life of the household in ways that suggest genuine relationship and mutual awareness between the living and the dead. The manifestations of Anne's presence became remarkably varied across the centuries of her haunting, adapting to the particular circumstances and needs of the household, while maintaining core characteristics that remained consistent. Reports describe Anne's presence activating in response to specific situations, appearing to warn of danger, manifesting disapproval when household members engaged in moral misconduct, becoming particularly active during times of crisis or transition within the family. One of the most significant implications of this ongoing presence involves the question of Anne's consciousness and awareness. The manifestations suggest that Anne remained not in a static, unchanging state of haunting, but rather in a condition of ongoing awareness, responsive to what was occurring in the house, capable of learning about new situations, able to adapt her manifestations to current circumstances. This raises profound questions about the nature of post-mortem consciousness. If Anne's ghost could perceive events in the house, could recognize situations, could make judgments about appropriate responses, what does that suggest about the continuity and development of consciousness after physical death? Family members and household staff across centuries reported that Anne's presence seemed to understand modern developments and changes to the house. When rooms were renovated, Anne's manifestations appeared to acknowledge and respond to the changes. When new residents arrived, her presence seemed to evaluate them and determine whether they posed threat to the values she had invested in the house. The impression that emerges from these accounts is of a consciousness that was not trapped in past moment, but rather engaged in ongoing experience of the house's evolution. One particularly notable account involves the arrival of a new servant in the household during the 18th century, a woman of questionable moral character, who immediately began engaging in behavior that violated the standards Anne had apparently maintained throughout her haunting. The accounts describe that Anne's presence became increasingly active and disturbing during this woman's time in the house, manifesting in ways that appeared designed to force the woman's departure. The woman eventually left, and immediately, upon her departure, the manifestations ceased and the house returned to its accustomed state of comfortable haunting. The story suggests not merely that Anne's ghost was manifesting according to preset patterns, but rather that she was making judgments, recognizing situations, making decisions about appropriate responses. She was, in other words, demonstrating the kind of ongoing consciousness and agency that we associate with living people making real-time decisions rather than programmed responses. The relationship between the family and Anne's presence evolved over centuries in ways that suggest mutual adaptation and deepening understanding. Early manifestations had been disturbing and frightening. The family had experienced Anne's presence as tormenting and oppressive. But gradually, as decades and then centuries passed, the manifestations evolved into something that residents described as comforting and protective. The family learned how to recognize Anne's presence, how to interpret what her manifestations meant, how to respond appropriately to her communications. The household appears to have developed a kind of relationship with Anne, one that was not precisely like relationships with the living, but that possessed genuine elements of companionship and mutual care. Family members spoke of feeling Anne's protection, of being aware of her presence when they needed reassurance or guidance. The house became understood as inhabited by a consciousness that cared about its inhabitants and was invested in their well-being and moral development. The most touching accounts involve situations where Anne's presence manifested not to enforce morality or provide warning, but simply to provide comfort. Family members and servants reported experiencing Anne's presence during times of grief or distress, not in frightening ways, but in ways that felt like genuine presence and support. The accounts describe a consciousness that had evolved from expressing anguished protest at being betrayed to expressing care and protection for the living inhabitants of the house she loved. The preservation of Anne's skull became one of the family's most significant responsibilities, a duty that was understood to be essential to maintaining the connection between the living and Anne's continuing presence. The skull was never displayed publicly or treated as a mere curiosity, but rather was kept in a place of honor and was handled with the reverence that one might accord to a sacred object. The understanding was that as long as the skull remained in Burton Agnes Hall, Anne's presence would be anchored there, would remain engaged with the house and family, would continue the protection and guidance that her consciousness had committed itself to providing. Here's something that raises fundamental questions about relationships that transcend death. From which country are you watching this? Because every tradition has understood that love and commitment might survive the boundary of death and that the living and dead might maintain meaningful connection across that boundary. What experiences from your culture or family suggest that bonds formed in life might persist beyond physical death? How do different traditions honor and maintain connection with those who have died? Share your reflections in the comments. The most scientifically challenging aspect of the Burton Agnes case involves the physical manifestations that were reported across centuries, phenomena that could not be attributed to psychological suggestion or hallucination because they involved effects on the physical world. Accounts describe Anne's presence moving objects, creating sounds that multiple people witnessed simultaneously, manifesting as visible apparitions that could be observed and described in detail by multiple witnesses. One particularly well-documented account from the 18th century involves a manifestation witnessed simultaneously by multiple household members. The accounts describe Anne's apparition appearing in one of the house's rooms, visible to everyone present, maintaining stable form for several minutes, and then gradually fading from view. The witnesses provided consistent descriptions of what they had seen: her clothing, her facial expression, the quality of the apparition, suggesting they had experienced something genuinely perceived rather than individual hallucinations or imagined experiences. These physical manifestations raise questions that stretch the boundaries of contemporary physics and our understanding of consciousness and materiality. How could a discarnate consciousness affect the physical world? What mechanisms would allow an entity without a physical body to move objects or become visible to human eyes? The conventional materialist worldview provides no adequate explanation for such phenomena, yet the documented accounts suggest they did occur. Some researchers and theorists have attempted to explain such phenomena through concepts of fields or energies that might allow consciousness to manifest effects on the physical world even after the body's death. Others have suggested that consciousness might have access to dimensions of reality that our ordinary perception doesn't typically access, and that under certain circumstances, bridges might form between those dimensions and ordinary physical reality. These are speculative theories, yet they represent attempts to take seriously the documented evidence while maintaining engagement with scientific methodology and reasoning. The question of why Anne's manifestations persisted so consistently across centuries while most documented hauntings fade or diminish over time is particularly intriguing. The answer that emerges from the evidence is that Anne's haunting persisted because of the continuing dedication of the family to maintaining the connection, because Anne's skull remained carefully protected and honored, because the family continued to acknowledge her presence, because the tradition of her haunting was maintained through stories and recognition passed from generation to generation. This suggests a reciprocal relationship between the living and the dead, that Anne's presence could continue and deepen because the family honored it, and that the family's honoring of Anne's presence was maintained because her manifestations demonstrated genuine awareness and care. The haunting became self-perpetuating through this cycle of mutual engagement and recognition. The question that has haunted investigations of the Burton Agnes case across centuries is deceptively simple. What actually causes a ghost? What is the mechanism through which consciousness persists after death? Through which it can manifest in the physical world? Through which it can remain engaged with the living and the material places it had inhabited? The cases offers clues to these profound mysteries, though the answers it suggests challenge nearly everything that contemporary science has established about consciousness and reality. The most obvious mechanism of Anne's haunting, the one that makes her case unique among documented ghost stories, is the preservation of her skull within the house. The family's conviction that the skull functioned as an anchor for Anne's consciousness, that her awareness remained connected to her physical remains, suggests an understanding of consciousness as fundamentally connected to physical matter in ways that materialist philosophy might not immediately recognize. Modern neuroscience has generally understood consciousness as an emergent property of brain function, something that arises from the physical processes of the brain and ceases when those processes end. Yet the case of Anne Griffiths suggests an alternative understanding, that consciousness might be something more fundamental than the physical processes that typically generate it, that it might be capable of persisting after the physical substrate through which it ordinarily manifests has ceased to function. This is not a new idea. It has roots in philosophical and spiritual traditions extending back millennia. Plato suggested that consciousness or the soul was non-material and eternal. Hindu and Buddhist traditions understood consciousness as fundamental to reality, rather than as a byproduct of physical processes. Some versions of quantum mechanics suggest that consciousness plays a fundamental role in the structure of reality itself. The Burton Agnes case can be understood as offering empirical evidence, supporting these ancient understandings against the materialist assumptions that have dominated Western science. The role of the physical skull as an anchor for Anne's consciousness raises interesting questions about how consciousness and physicality relate. The skull itself is merely bone. It has no special inherent properties beyond those of any other calcium compound. Yet the accounts of the Burton Agnes haunting suggest that the skull functioned as a kind of focal point for Anne's presence, that her consciousness remained particularly connected to and manifested through this specific object. One possible interpretation involves understanding the skull as a kind of receiving station or antenna through which Anne's consciousness could connect to and manifest in the physical world. The analogy would be similar to how radio signals might be transmitted through physical towers. The physical structure doesn't generate the signal but provides a mechanism through which an energy or signal originating elsewhere can be expressed in the physical world. From this perspective, Anne's consciousness continued to exist in some non-physical dimension of reality, but her ability to manifest effects in the physical world depended on her having a material anchor, her skull, through which she could express her presence. This interpretation is speculative, yet it provides a framework for understanding how the documented phenomena could occur, how a consciousness could survive physical death while remaining connected to and able to manifest effects in the physical world, where it no longer had a body. Another dimension of the mechanism involves understanding the role of emotional intensity and purposefulness in Anne's haunting. The accounts consistently describe Anne's manifestations as arising from strong emotional content, her anguish and protest at her dying wish being violated, her disapproval of moral misconduct, her protectiveness toward the household members she cared about. This suggests that emotion might be a crucial factor in bridging the gap between consciousness and physical manifestation. The strongest manifestations in Anne's haunting occurred at moments of highest emotional intensity. When the violation of her dying wish first occurred, when she became aware of dishonest servants, when crises threatened the household, the manifestations appeared to diminish when the emotional charge decreased, as the household adapted to living with her presence, as the circumstances that had provoked her disappeared, as her relationship with the family deepened into something less antagonistic and more mutually supportive. This pattern suggests that consciousness operating outside of physical embodiment might require emotional intensity to bridge the gap between non-physical and physical reality. The more intensely Anne felt something, the more her presence manifested in ways that could be perceived and experienced by the living. This understanding aligns with various spiritual and esoteric traditions that understand strong emotion, love, grief, anguish, devotion, as particularly powerful forces capable of transcending ordinary boundaries. The question of time also becomes relevant to understanding the mechanism of Anne's haunting. Most documented ghosts are understood as relatively fixed entities, spirits that replay the same events repeatedly, or that manifest in limited, programmed ways. Yet Anne's presence evolved and adapted across centuries. She responded to new situations, appeared to learn from experience, developed more nuanced and sophisticated forms of communication with her household. This evolution over time suggests that Anne's consciousness continued to experience change, development, and learning even after her physical death. She was not trapped in a moment, but rather engaged in an ongoing process of existence and awareness. Her consciousness appeared to be capable of growth, of deepening wisdom, of increasingly sophisticated understanding of how to interact with and care for the living inhabitants of her beloved house. The mechanism that would allow for this kind of ongoing development and learning in a post-mortem consciousness remains mysterious from the perspective of contemporary science. Yet the documented evidence of Burton Agnes suggests that, whatever the actual mechanism might be, consciousness does appear capable of persisting beyond physical death and of continuing to develop and deepen in ways that resemble the development that occurs in living individuals. Here's something that reveals how different cultures have understood the survival of consciousness and the possibility of its continued development after death. From which country are you watching this? Because your tradition almost certainly has teachings about what happens to consciousness or the soul after death, and how the dead continue to exist in relationship to the living. Do these traditional understandings suggest that consciousness continues to develop after death, that it might be capable of ongoing awareness and interaction? What mechanisms does your tradition understand to be operating in the relationship between the living and the dead? Share your thoughts in the comments. The role of the family's belief and expectations in maintaining Anne's presence raises important questions about the relationship between consciousness and expectation. Did Anne's haunting persist because the family continued to believe in it and expect it? Or did the family's belief and expectation persist because Anne's genuine presence continued to manifest itself and demand recognition? The evidence suggests a reciprocal relationship rather than simple causation in one direction. Anne's manifestations were strong enough and consistent, enough to create genuine belief in her presence. The manifestations weren't merely confirming expectations, but rather providing new experiences that would compel belief even from those who might have been skeptical. Yet the family's willingness to honor and maintain their relationship with Anne's presence appears to have supported and strengthened her ability to continue manifesting. This reciprocal dynamic suggests that consciousness might exist in relationship to reality in more complex ways than contemporary materialism typically acknowledges. Consciousness might not be a purely objective phenomenon that exists independent of observation. It might instead be something that exists in relationship to recognition and acknowledgement. Anne's presence persisted in this understanding, not despite the materialist skepticism of later centuries, but because the family's continued belief and honor created the conditions through which her consciousness could maintain itself in connection to the physical world. The scientific investigation of the Burton Agnes haunting was limited by the technological tools available in the Victorian era and by the epistemological limitations of 19th century science. Modern investigators with contemporary measurement equipment, thermal imaging, EMF detectors, audio recording equipment, video surveillance, might be able to document manifestations with greater precision than Victorian spiritualist investigators could achieve. Yet no systematic modern investigation appears to have been conducted. The credibility of the Burton Agnes case rests fundamentally on the testimony of the witnesses who experienced Anne's manifestations. The family members, servants, and investigators who encountered phenomena they believed to be genuine expressions of a persisting consciousness. Yet the challenge in assessing the weight of this testimony involves fundamental questions about how we evaluate evidence, what counts as proof, and whether subjective experience can provide an adequate basis for accepting extraordinary claims. The Victorian era saw the emergence of spiritualism as a serious intellectual movement, with educated individuals, including scientists, philosophers, and cultural leaders, taking seriously the possibility that consciousness survived death and that communication with the dead might be possible. This intellectual context made serious investigation of cases like Burton Agnes possible in ways that later eras would make more difficult as materialism became increasingly dominant in scientific thinking. The spiritualist Investigators who documented the Burton Agnes case attempted to apply rigorous standards of evidence, interviewing multiple witnesses, comparing accounts for consistency, searching for alternative explanations before accepting supernatural interpretations, and recognizing limitations in their own investigations. While their methodology would not meet contemporary scientific standards in several ways, their investigations were serious attempts to take the evidence seriously and to determine what could actually be concluded from the documented phenomena. The most significant finding from these investigations was the remarkable consistency of witness accounts across centuries and across different observers. The characteristics of Anne's manifestations remained stable. Her identity as Anne Griffith, her concern with the household's moral conduct, her protectiveness toward family members, her connection to her skull and to Burton Agnes Hall. Individual witnesses added details and nuances, but the fundamental story remained consistent in ways that seemed unlikely, if the phenomena were based in hallucination or suggestion. The skeptical response to the Burton Agnes case has typically taken several forms. The most fundamental skepticism questions whether subjective experience can ever provide adequate evidence for extraordinary claims. From this perspective, no matter how consistent the witness testimony, no matter how many observers have reported similar phenomena, subjective experience simply doesn't meet the standard for proof. Only objective, repeatable, third-party verifiable evidence could establish the reality of something like a genuine ghost. This epistemological position is defensible within the framework of scientific materialism, yet it creates a peculiar asymmetry. It establishes standards of evidence that no subjective phenomenon, including our own consciousness, could fully meet. If we applied these standards consistently, we might question whether anyone else's consciousness is real, since consciousness is fundamentally subjective and not directly observable to third parties. The extreme skeptical position, taken to its logical conclusion, leads to a kind of philosophical solipsism that most people find untenable. More moderate skeptical response acknowledges the consistency and persistence of the Burton Agnes accounts but seeks to explain them through psychological mechanisms. From this perspective, belief in the haunting could have created expectations that shaped how household members interpreted ambiguous sensory experiences. A creaking floorboard becomes Anne's presence when a sudden draft becomes a manifestation. Natural phenomena are interpreted as supernatural through the lens of existing belief. This psychological explanation is plausible for some individual accounts, yet it becomes increasingly difficult to maintain when applied to the consistent pattern of phenomena across centuries and across diverse observers. The accounts describe phenomena that go well beyond simple misinterpretation of ambiguous sensory input. Apparitions maintained in stable form for extended periods, objects move through rooms, voices that multiple people hear simultaneously, apparitions appearing and disappearing before witnesses, who were fully alert and skeptical. The most sophisticated, skeptical response acknowledges the phenomena as genuinely experienced by witnesses while remaining uncertain about the cause. From this perspective, something was occurring at Burton Agnes Hall that genuinely affected people and that they genuinely experienced. But the cause of these phenomena might be something other than Anne Griffith's ghost. Perhaps electromagnetic anomalies affecting brain function, perhaps unconscious psychological phenomena expressing themselves through the poltergeist effect. Perhaps some unknown natural phenomenon that our science simply hasn't yet adequately explained. This agnostic position has merit. It acknowledges the reality of the reported experiences while remaining open about their ultimate cause. Yet it also tends to assume that a natural explanation must exist, that any explanation within scientific materialism is preferable to accepting the possibility of genuine survival of consciousness after death. This assumption itself represents a philosophical commitment rather than a requirement of evidence. There's nothing inherent in the evidence that demands a materialist explanation. Here's something that reveals how our fundamental worldview assumptions shape what explanations we're willing to accept. From which country are you watching this? Because your tradition likely has different assumptions than Western materialism about what kinds of phenomena are possible and what kinds of explanations are acceptable. How does your culture approach evidence for spiritual or supernatural phenomena? What standards of proof do you use for claims that Western science would be skeptical of? How do you decide what to believe when subjective experience contradicts dominant worldview assumptions? Share your thoughts in the comments. The question of how to weigh and evaluate testimony becomes crucial in assessing the Burton Agnes case. When hundreds of people across centuries report consistent experiences that support a coherent narrative, what weight should that testimony receive? The standard practice in law and historical analysis is to accept testimony from credible witnesses as evidence unless there's good reason to suspect dishonesty or delusion. Applied to Burton Agnes, the testimonies come from family members with no apparent motivation to lie. Indeed, many appeared embarrassed by or reluctant to acknowledge the haunting, suggesting they were honestly reporting what they experienced rather than fabricating tales. The testimonies come from servants and household staff who had no particular investment in promoting belief in a ghost. The testimonies come from investigators and researchers, motivated by genuine scientific curiosity to understand the phenomena. The consistency across these diverse sources, across centuries of time, across different cultural contexts as society evolved and changed, suggests that something was genuinely being experienced and reported. The question is what that genuine experience represents, whether it's evidence of consciousness, surviving death, or whether it indicates some other phenomenon operating in ways that our science doesn't yet adequately understand. The most challenging testimonies for skeptics to dismiss involve the physical phenomena, the instances where multiple witnesses simultaneously observed apparitions, heard sounds, or witnessed object movements. These accounts are much less vulnerable to being explained away through individual hallucination or psychological suggestion. Such explanations become increasingly strained when multiple people simultaneously experience the same phenomenon. One particularly significant witness to the Burton Agnes haunting was a visitor who came to the house with explicit skepticism and materialist assumptions. According to accounts, this visitor was initially dismissive of the stories about the ghost, assuming they represented the superstitious beliefs of a credulous family and household. Yet after experiencing manifestations directly, after witnessing phenomena that couldn't be easily explained through natural causes, the visitor appears to have had a profound shift in worldview, becoming convinced through direct experience that something genuine was occurring that transcended conventional explanation. The pattern of skeptics becoming convinced through direct experience is significant. It suggests that the phenomena were powerful enough and distinctive enough to shift even people who came with strong prior assumptions against believing in ghosts. This speaks to the genuine nature of what was being experienced. It was not merely confirming existing beliefs, but rather overwhelming prior skepticism with undeniable experience. The story of Burton Agnes Hall, in its ultimate significance, is not primarily a ghost story. It is a profound statement about consciousness, death, and the possibilities for continuation and relationship across boundaries that we typically understand as absolute and final. The haunting of Anne Griffiths suggests answers to some of humanity's most ancient and persistent questions. What happens to consciousness after death? Can the dead remain aware of and engaged with the world of the living? Is it possible for love and commitment to persist across the boundary of bodily death? The evidence from Burton Agnes suggests affirmative answers to these questions, though necessarily provisional and requiring interpretation. What emerges from 4 centuries of documented manifestations is a picture of Anne Griffith as a consciousness that did not cease with her bodily death, that remained connected to her beloved house and to the family she had devoted herself to, that developed and deepened across centuries in its understanding of how to care for and communicate with the living inhabitants of the house. This understanding challenges the materialist assumption that consciousness is merely a byproduct of brain function and must cease when the brain dies. The evidence suggests instead that consciousness might be something more fundamental, something that ordinarily manifests through and depends on the physical brain, but that is capable of persisting and continuing to exist and develop even after the brain has ceased to function. The mechanisms through which such persistence might occur remain mysterious, as they must when attempting to explain phenomena that transcend the boundaries of our conventional understanding. Yet the consistent pattern of evidence across centuries suggests that something like persistence of consciousness is possible, even if we cannot yet explain exactly how it occurs or what mechanisms might be operating. The question of what Anne Griffiths' consciousness experienced during her 400 years of haunting raises Profound questions about the nature of time and experience. Did Anne experience those centuries consciously, in a way that resembled human experience of duration? Or did her consciousness exist outside of time, present in all moments simultaneously? The account suggests something in between. Anne appears to have remained conscious and engaged, capable of learning and development, yet also capable of patient waiting across centuries. Her experience of duration was likely radically different from human experience, yet not entirely alien to it. The persistence of Anne's presence appears to have depended crucially on two factors. First, the physical anchor of her skull remaining in the house, and second, the family's continued recognition and honoring of her presence. Neither factor alone seems sufficient. The skull without familial acknowledgement would presumably not have manifested conscious presence, and familial acknowledgement without the physical anchor might not have been able to sustain connection across centuries. This pattern suggests a model of postmortem existence in which consciousness requires certain conditions to maintain connection with the physical world and the living. The skull functioned as a kind of focal point or anchor, and the family's acknowledgement and respect functioned as a kind of energy or sustenance that allowed Anne's presence to continue manifesting. The haunting became self-perpetuating through this cycle of mutual engagement. The family honored Anne, and Anne's manifestations demonstrated care and protection, which deepened the family's honoring, which strengthened her presence. This is radically different from the popular conception of ghosts as souls trapped and tormenting, condemned to replay traumas eternally. Anne's presence was not a trap, but a choice, a commitment to continue engaging with a place and people she loved, achieved through conditions of being remembered and honored. The haunting was not pathological, but rather a form of deep love persisting across mortality's boundary. The question of what we are to make of Anne's example, what it means for us to understand that consciousness might continue after death and might remain engaged with the living, requires us to consider how this understanding should affect the way we live and relate to those around us. If consciousness does persist, if the dead can remain aware of the living, then our moral responsibility doesn't end at death. Our integrity, our conduct, our fidelity to our commitments continues to matter even after we die. The family's honoring of Anne's presence suggests an understanding that the living and dead exist in relationship, that we have responsibilities toward those who have died, that we can support their continuation through remembrance and respect, that we can maintain connection across mortality's boundary through genuine relationship. This stands in contrast to modern materialist culture, which tends to treat death as total severance and encourages the living to move on and forget those who have died. Here's something that reveals radically different understandings of the relationship between the living and the dead. From which country are you watching this? Because your culture likely understands the living and dead as existing in ongoing relationship in ways that Western materialism has largely abandoned. How does your tradition maintain connection with those who have died? What obligations do you understand yourself to have toward the dead? How does understanding that the dead might remain aware affect how you think about your own actions and conduct? Share your reflections in the comments. The story of Burton Agnes also offers profound lessons about the importance of honoring final wishes and recognizing that what people request at the moment of death often reflects their deepest values and understanding of what matters most. Anne's dying request for her skull to remain in the house was not arbitrary or superstitious. It reflected her profound understanding of her own nature, her spiritual beliefs, and what was necessary for her consciousness to achieve peace and continuation. The family's initial betrayal of that wish, followed by their recognition of the terrible consequences and their ultimate rectification of the violation, offers a cautionary tale about how the living are tempted to dismiss the wishes of the dying, to rationalize why we don't need to honor requests that seem inconvenient or disturbing. Yet the story demonstrates that such dismissals have consequences, that the dead remember being betrayed, that consciousness persists with the capacity for anguish and protest, that true peace only comes when proper respect is shown. The transformation of Anne's haunting from tormented protest into protective care appears to have occurred through the process of her wishes being honored. Once the skull was returned to the house, once the family demonstrated their willingness to respect what mattered most to Anne, her consciousness appears to have been able to move beyond anguish and grief into a state of peace and purposeful engagement. The haunting evolved from destructive, manifestation of suffering into constructive presence, dedicated to the protection and well-being of those she cared for. The ultimate significance of Burton Agnes Hall may be that it offers empirical evidence for possibilities that humanity has understood spiritually and philosophically for millennia, but that modern Western culture had largely dismissed as impossible. The haunting demonstrates that consciousness might not be confined to life, that love might transcend death, that the dead might remain engaged with and devoted to caring for those they loved. For those who lived in Burton Agnes Hall across 4 centuries, Anne Griffith was not merely a ghost. She was a presence, a guardian, a manifestation of continuing care and protection that persisted despite death. The residents of the house developed a relationship with Anne that was real and significant, that provided comfort and guidance, that demonstrated a form of community transcending the boundary between life and death. For those who investigate the case from a distance, Burton Agnes represents evidence for possibilities that materialist science has been unwilling to seriously consider. The haunting offers a challenge to the assumption that consciousness is simply a product of brain function, that death is total severance, that only the physical world is real. The evidence from Burton Agnes suggests that reality might be more complex, more mysterious, and more full of possibility than materialism acknowledges. The haunting of Anne Griffith continues to this day. Visitors to Burton Agnes Hall report experiencing her presence. Family members remain aware of her protective manifestations. The skull continues to be honored and preserved. 4 centuries have passed since her death, and Anne Griffith remains present in the house she loved, continuing to watch over those who inhabit it, embodying an alternative understanding of death, not as ending but as transformation, not as severance but as deepening, not as the conclusion of care and commitment but as their continuation in new form. As we emerge from the ancient corridors of Burton Agnes Hall, returning to the contemporary world with its materialist certainties and its dismissal of the supernatural, we carry with us a story that seems impossible by modern standards, yet refuses to be dismissed by the weight of historical evidence and the consistency of centuries of testimony. The ghost of Anne Griffith stands as a challenge to the worldview that has dominated Western civilization for the past several hundred years, a challenge that invites us to reconsider what we truly know about consciousness, death, and the possibilities for relationship and connection across boundaries we assumed were absolute. We have followed the tragic arc of Anne's story, from her trauma at the hands of attackers, through her devotion to a place and family, to her dying wish for continuation, through her anguished haunting when that wish was betrayed, to her gradual transformation into a protective presence dedicated to the well-being of those she cared for. We have traced the evolution of her manifestations across centuries, from disturbing and tormenting to comforting and protective. We have examined the evidence that her consciousness persisted, that she remained aware, that she continued to develop and deepen her understanding across 400 years. The story of Burton Agnes teaches us that death may not be the absolute ending that modern culture assumes. It suggests that consciousness might be more fundamental than the physical brain, that awareness might persist in forms we don't yet understand, that love and commitment might transcend the boundary of bodily death. Most profoundly, it demonstrates the transformative power of honoring the dead, of showing respect to those who have passed, of keeping our promises to them, of maintaining connection and remembrance across the boundary of mortality. The haunting of Anne Griffith also challenges us to consider the moral and spiritual implications of her persistence. If consciousness does continue after death, if the dead remain aware and are affected by our conduct toward them, then our responsibility doesn't end at death. We should live our lives with awareness that what we do, how we treat others, and how we honor commitments matters not just in our earthly lives but potentially in dimensions beyond death. For those of you watching from different cultural and spiritual traditions, the Burton Agnes case may resonate with your own understandings of the relationship between the living and the dead. Many traditions maintain that the dead continue to exist, that they remain aware of the living, that proper honor and remembrance sustains them. The Burton Agnes evidence offers a compelling historical example from within Western culture of principles that many traditions have always understood. If the investigation of the relationship between consciousness and mortality has moved you, make sure you're subscribed to History Unleashed and hit that notification bell, because we're committed to bringing you evidence from history that challenges materialist assumptions and invites us to expand our understanding of what is possible. What resonates most deeply for you in the story of Anne Griffith and Burton Agnes? Does it align with understandings from your own tradition about death and the continuation of consciousness? How does it change your thinking about honoring the dead and maintaining relationship with those who have passed beyond the physical world? Do you believe that consciousness might survive death, and if so, how does that understanding affect how you want to live your life? Share your profound reflections in the comments, and let us know what other mysteries of consciousness, death, and the afterlife you'd like us to explore. Remember, for over 400 years, Anne Griffiths' presence has remained in Burton Agnes Hall, a testament to the power of love persisting beyond death, a challenge to the materialist worldview that insists death is final, and an invitation to consider that reality might contain mysteries far deeper than our dominant culture acknowledges. Whether you interpret her presence as spiritual, psychological, or through frameworks we don't yet possess, the evidence of her enduring care and commitment offers a profound reminder that some bonds transcend even mortality itself. Thank you for journeying with us into the mystery of Burton Agnes. Until we meet again in the territories between life and death where the greatest mysteries dwell, remain open to possibilities beyond conventional understanding. Honor the dead through remembrance and respect, and trust that love, once deeply rooted, might flower across all boundaries. The skull remains. Anne Griffith watches. The house stands holding 4 centuries of secrets and manifestations, and in the Yorkshire countryside, where ancient stones meet modern skepticism, a ghost continues her patient vigil, a presence that refuses to be forgotten, a consciousness that will not rest until the final promise is kept, a manifestation of love persisting beyond all boundaries.